For decades, James Garner was known as one of Hollywood's most honest men. He didn't cultivate mystery, he didn't hide behind a carefully designed persona, and he rarely spoke badly about his colleagues. That was why, when his words about Steve McQueen finally surfaced, they landed with such quiet force. Garner and McQueen shared the screen in The Great Escape, a film remembered as a celebration of courage, brotherhood, and defiance. But behind the barbed wire and heroic music, another struggle unfolded, one without gunfire, without shouting, and without a clear winner. It was a clash of two very different kinds of men, shaped by very different kinds of survival. James Garner had already fought battles that didn't require cameras. He had endured a brutal childhood, real combat in Korea, and a Hollywood system that tried to control him and failed. By the time he stepped onto the set of The Great Escape, he didn't need to prove that he was tough, dangerous, or unforgettable. He already knew who he was. Steve McQueen, on the other hand, was becoming something else entirely. A rising symbol of rebellion, a carefully guarded image, a star whose power depended on being seen, felt, and never overshadowed. In an ensemble cast where the spotlight was meant to be shared, that tension mattered. For years, Garner said nothing. Not because he was afraid, not because he lost, but because some stories, in Hollywood, cannot be told while the system is still watching. Only much later, when the stakes were gone, when the noise had faded, did Garner finally describe what it was really like to work beside Steve McQueen. This is not a story about hatred or rivalry in the usual sense. It is a story about ego, insecurity, and the unspoken rules of fame, about why Hollywood celebrates the men who burn out, but quietly moves past the ones who survive. And about why, sometimes, the most powerful truths are the ones spoken last. Long before James Garner became a familiar face on television screens and movie posters, survival was already a skill he had mastered. Born in 1,928 inches rural Oklahoma, Garner's early life was shaped not by comfort or stability, but by loss and endurance. His mother died when he was just 5 years old, leaving behind a family already struggling to stay afloat during the Great Depression. What followed was not healing, but fracture. His father, overwhelmed by grief and financial ruin, turned increasingly to alcohol. When a fire destroyed the family's hardware store, whatever sense of security remained vanished with it. Garner and his brothers were shuffled through a childhood marked by neglect and, later, cruelty. His stepmother's abuse, both physical and psychological, left scars that Garner would carry quietly for the rest of his life. At 14, pushed beyond his limit, he fought back. It was not a moment of triumph, but of survival. And it taught him a lesson that would define his adulthood. Boundaries matter. That instinct to endure rather than perform followed Garner into the military. Drafted into the U.S. Army during the Korean War, he served as an infantryman and was wounded twice, once by enemy fire and later by friendly fire. He received 2 Purple Hearts, though he rarely mentioned them. War did not turn him into a mythic hero, it turned him into someone deeply allergic to unnecessary bravado. Having faced real danger, Garner would never be impressed by men who needed to look dangerous for a living. When he returned home, Hollywood was not an immediate destination. He worked odd jobs, modeled briefly, and even considered paths that had nothing to do with acting. His entry into the industry came almost by accident after a chance reconnection with talent agent Paul Gregory. Garner had no formal training, no grand ambition to reinvent cinema. What he had was presence unforced, unpolished, and believable. That presence became impossible to ignore when he was cast as Brett Maverick in the television series Maverick in 1957. The role did not demand swagger or dominance. Instead, it rewarded wit, restraint, and timing. Audiences responded instantly. Garner wasn't playing the toughest man in the room, he was playing the smartest. And in doing so, he became something rare, a television star who didn't feel manufactured. Yet, success came with a price. Despite the show's popularity, Garner found himself underpaid and undervalued by the studio system. When a writer's strike halted production, Warner Bros. Laid him off without hesitation. For Garner, it was a familiar pattern authority exerted without fairness. This time, however, he didn't endure it quietly. He sued the studio, and he won. Walking away from Maverick was not a career move driven by ego, but by principle. Garner had already learned that real power wasn't about dominating others, it was about knowing when to step away. That victory over the system would shape how he approached every conflict that followed, including the one that awaited him on the set of The Great Escape. By the early 1960s, James Garner had become something Hollywood didn't quite know how to categorize, too grounded to be dangerous, too steady to be mythologized, and perhaps most unsettling of all, too secure in himself to compete for attention. When James Garner joined the cast of The Great Escape, he entered a film that was already larger than any single man. The project was ambitious, carefully assembled as an ensemble: British officers, American prisoners, hardened veterans, strategists, diggers, forgers. No lone hero, no central star. The story itself was meant to lead. On paper, this structure promised balance. In reality, it created pressure. Steve McQueen arrived on set as a man on the brink of transformation. He was no longer unknown, but he was not yet untouchable. What he carried with him was momentum, and an acute awareness of how fragile that momentum could be. McQueen understood something fundamental about Hollywood. Visibility was survival. To disappear, even briefly, was to risk being replaced. Garner stood in sharp contrast. He had already proven he could walk away from success and still land on his feet. He wasn't chasing validation, and he wasn't trying to reshape the film around himself. His role, the Scrounger, required charm, restraint, and credibility. It wasn't flashy, but it worked. And more importantly, audiences instinctively trusted him. That trust mattered. As filming progressed, subtle tensions began to surface. Not arguments, not shouting matches, just a series of small adjustments that the camera would notice, even if no one spoke about them aloud. Crew members later recalled McQueen's habit of shifting slightly during shared shots, leaning, moving, delaying an exit by a fraction of a second. Nothing that violated the script, nothing that could be formally challenged, but enough to pull focus. Garner noticed. Of course he did, but he didn't respond in kind. He didn't counter with tricks or gestures. He stayed exactly where he was meant to be. For him, the scene didn't need embellishment. The work spoke for itself. That silence, paradoxically, amplified him. In an ensemble where many were trying not to fade, Garner never seemed to vanish. His stillness carried weight. His confidence didn't announce itself. And for McQueen, who was carefully constructing a screen persona built on rebellion and dominance, that quiet authority was unsettling. The tension reached the attention of director John Sturges, a seasoned filmmaker who valued discipline and cohesion. Sturges understood the danger of imbalance. A film like The Great Escape could collapse if one presence overshadowed the others. Yet he was also aware of studio expectations. McQueen was young, marketable, and increasingly essential to the film's commercial appeal. Caught between artistic balance and industrial pressure, Sturges tried to contain the friction. Scenes were adjusted, camera choices reconsidered. Eventually, additional moments were shaped to give McQueen's character more kinetic energy, culminating in the now legendary motorcycle escape. The change worked spectacularly for audiences, but it also quietly shifted the film's internal power dynamics. Garner watched all of this without protest. He did not demand equal compensation in screen time. He did not challenge McQueen publicly, and he did not lobby the studio. That restraint was not weakness, it was choice. Behind the scenes, the air remained charged. McQueen kept his distance, staying apart from the group, reinforcing his outsider image. Garner remained professional, present, and largely unaffected. Two men, two strategies, moving in opposite directions within the same frame. What the audience saw was a classic. What they didn't see was a fundamental question taking shape behind the camera. In Hollywood, is talent enough, or must it be accompanied by dominance to survive? As production moved deeper into The Great Escape, the tension that had quietly formed on set began to take on a more defined shape. It was no longer just about personalities or subtle shifts in blocking, it became about control. About who the film was beginning to revolve around, and who the industry was preparing to elevate. Steve McQueen's presence was impossible for executives to ignore. Daily footage revealed something the studio instinctively recognized. Younger audiences gravitated toward him. His physicality, his defiant stillness, the sense that he might explode or disappear at any moment, these were qualities Hollywood knew how to sell. In an era where stars were commodities, McQueen represented momentum, and momentum demanded amplification. John Sturges understood the danger of this shift. He was not a director who believed in chaos or indulgence. The Great Escape had been designed as a collective effort, a carefully balanced machine where every character served the larger narrative. Too much weight in one place could fracture the entire structure. Yet Sturges also knew the realities of studio filmmaking. Resistance had limits. Notes from the studio began to arrive more frequently. At first, they were phrased as suggestions requests to enhance McQueen's character, to give him moments that felt more dynamic, more visually arresting. Over time, those suggestions hardened into expectations. McQueen needed a defining sequence, something iconic, something that would linger in the audience's memory long after the ensemble blurred together. That pressure gave birth to the motorcycle escape. It was not part of the original plan. It was an addition shaped by marketing instincts as much as storytelling logic. The sequence stripped dialogue down to its bare minimum and replaced it with motion speed, risk, rebellion made visible. McQueen became a figure in constant movement, framed against open space and barbed wire, a man defined by refusal. The impact was immediate. From a cinematic standpoint, the scene worked brilliantly. It injected adrenaline into the film and gave audiences a moment they would replay for decades. But within the production, it marked a subtle realignment. The film's center of gravity shifted. What had once been evenly distributed now leaned toward one figure. James Garner observed this transformation closely. He did not object, and he did not intervene. Having already fought and defeated studio authority earlier in his career, Garner recognized the futility of challenging this particular decision. He understood that Hollywood rarely reversed course once momentum had been chosen. More importantly, Garner did not equate visibility with value. While McQueen's character expanded outward, gaining movement, space, and spectacle, Garner's strength remained internal. His performance relied on timing, trust, and restraint. He believed that presence did not need reinforcement. The camera could move away, but the audience's attention did not necessarily follow. This philosophical divide defined the remainder of the shoot. McQueen embraced isolation, reinforcing his image as an outsider, a rebel apart from the group. Garner stayed embedded within the ensemble, maintaining professionalism and consistency. Two men navigating the same system with entirely different survival strategies. For Sturges, the decision to accommodate the motorcycle sequence was pragmatic. It preserved studio support and ensured the film's release without conflict. For the studio, it was validation, a calculated risk that paid off. And for Garner, it was confirmation of something he already knew. Hollywood rewards motion over stillness, spectacle over balance. By the time filming wrapped, The Great Escape had become more than a film. It was a case study in how power moves quietly within the industry, not through confrontation, but through emphasis, not through arguments, but through framing. The tension never exploded. It didn't need to. The hierarchy had already been decided. For most of his career, James Garner chose silence. Not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of timing. In Hollywood, truth does not simply depend on accuracy, it depends on when it is spoken. Garner understood that long before he ever put pen to paper, while The Great Escape became a classic and Steve McQueen's image hardened into legend, Garner moved forward without commentary. He worked, he aged, he survived, and in doing so, he learned something fundamental about the industry. Stories told too early are absorbed by noise. Stories told too late become history. It was only after the stakes were gone, after careers had settled and reputations no longer needed protection, that Garner finally spoke with clarity. In his memoir, The Garner Files, he did not dramatize the past. He didn't frame it as a feud. Instead, he described a pattern. Garner was careful with his language. He acknowledged McQueen's undeniable charisma, his raw magnetism, and the reason audiences could not look away. But he drew a line that few had dared to articulate. In Garner's view, McQueen was not driven primarily by craft in the traditional sense. He was driven by image. To Garner, McQueen functioned less as an actor disappearing into roles and more as a movie star carrying the same emotional architecture from film to film. That architecture, cool detachment, rebellion, danger, was powerful. But it was also fragile. Once cracked, it had to be defended at all costs. According to Garner, that need for defense came from deep insecurity, not weakness, but fear of being replaced, overshadowed, or rendered irrelevant in an industry that constantly refreshes its idols. McQueen believed visibility was survival. To lose the frame was to lose position. Garner understood that instinct, but he did not share it. Where McQueen protected his image aggressively, Garner trusted endurance. He believed a performance did not need to dominate a frame to matter. It needed to feel true, and truth, he believed, lingered longer than spectacle. In the Garner files, he described moments when McQueen's anxiety spilled beyond the set, sudden mood shifts, suspicions, emotional volatility. None of it framed as cruelty, none of it presented as malice. Garner did not paint McQueen as a monster. He painted him as a man constantly bracing for impact. One of the most revealing elements of Garner's account was his inclusion of McQueen's wife. Garner recalled private conversations in which she confided her husband's jealousy and fear of betrayal, not because he lacked love, but because he lacked security. These were not stories told to embarrass. They were offered as context. What made Garner's perspective so disarming was its restraint. He never claimed moral superiority. He never positioned himself as the better man. He simply explained the difference in how they moved through the same system. For Garner, survival meant knowing when not to fight. It meant understanding that not every battle required resistance. Silence, in his case, was not submission, it was control. By the time he wrote the Garner files, Garner no longer needed Hollywood's approval. He had already won his battles elsewhere with studios, with health, with time itself. That distance gave him clarity, and clarity allowed him to speak without bitterness. In the end, Garner didn't dismantle McQueen's legend. He humanized it. He reminded readers that behind every icon is someone navigating fear and identity inside a machine that rewards extremes. What he finally revealed was not a rivalry but a collision between two survival strategies, neither entirely wrong, neither entirely free. Hollywood has always loved a certain kind of man, the restless one, the volatile one. The figure who burns brightly, then collapses under the weight of his own legend. These are the men history remembers easily because their stories end loudly. Within the world of The Great Escape, that contrast was impossible to miss. Each actor embodied a different version of masculinity. Some were disciplined, some were bitter, some were quietly professional, and some carried their wounds so openly that the camera could not look away. James Garner represented a type Hollywood rarely knew what to do with. He was steady, grounded, uninterested in self-destruction. His masculinity was defined by restraint rather than dominance, by consistency rather than chaos. He didn't romanticize pain, and he didn't perform suffering for attention. As a result, his legacy unfolded slowly. Without myth, others followed different paths. There were men hardened by resentment, who believed they had been denied recognition. There were men who treated conflict as proof of authenticity. And there were men who understood the system well enough to survive it without becoming consumed by it. What separated Garner from many of his peers was not talent, it was outcome. He lived long enough to watch Hollywood repeat the same cycle over and over again. New rebels, new icons, new tragedies. The industry applauded the flames, then moved on to the next fire. McQueen became part of that mythic tradition. His image, frozen in motion, rebellion distilled into still frames, fit perfectly into Hollywood's preferred narrative. It was dramatic. It was dangerous. And it ended before time could dull it. Garner's story did not end that way. It continued, quietly, without spectacle, and that difference mattered. In an industry obsessed with legends, survival can feel almost invisible. The men who endure often do so without becoming symbols. They age, they change, they complicate the story. And complication is harder to market than tragedy. By the time Garner reflected on his career, he seemed to understand this clearly. Hollywood didn't forget him, but it never needed him to become a myth. He remained something rarer, a witness, a participant who stepped out of the spotlight intact, carrying memory instead of myth. And perhaps that is why his words about Steve McQueen resonated so deeply when they finally surfaced. Not because they tore a legend down, but because they reminded us that behind every icon is a human being, navigating fear, ego, and survival in a system that rewards excess and overlooks endurance. In the end, Hollywood remembers the men who burn, but it is shaped quietly by the ones who survive. James Garner did not wait for permission to tell his story. He waited for clarity. By the time he spoke openly about Steve McQueen, there was nothing left to win and nothing left to lose. The careers were over. The myths were already built. What remained was memory unpolished, incomplete, and finally safe to share. Garner never tried to rewrite history. He didn't claim victory, and he didn't ask for sympathy. What he offered instead was perspective. A reminder that behind every Hollywood legend is a human being navigating fear, ego, and survival inside a system that rewards spectacle more than balance. Steve McQueen became immortal because his image froze at its peak, forever young, forever dangerous, forever in motion. James Garner lived long enough to age, to change, and to step away without burning. And in Hollywood, that difference defines how stories are remembered. The industry celebrates the men who explode. It quietly moves past the men who endure, yet endurance leaves its own mark. Garner's legacy was not carved by rebellion, but by restraint, not by domination, but by consistency. He survived Hollywood without becoming consumed by it, and in doing so, he preserved something rarer than legend: truth. In the end, this was never a story about rivalry. It was a story about two ways of surviving the same machine. One chose to be seen at all costs. The other chose to remain intact. And perhaps the real question is not which man Hollywood remembers more, but which one truly walked away with himself still whole.